You're listening to episode 289 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practices from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Sumi Loundon Kim joins us to speak about teaching Buddhism within a family setting. Before we begin today's episode, I'd like to mention that this podcast and the supporting website, discussion forums, our live online practice circle, and other services provided by the Secular Buddhist Association are supported by you. If you find this episode or any other offerings helpful to you in some way, I ask that you take a moment and visit secularbuddhism.org and click on the contributions button. There are many ways you can help, which are listed on that page, and if you want to make a donation, it's tax-deductible and helps ensure the SBA is able to continue the exploration of secular Buddhism. Thank you. We're glad to have you join us on the conversation. Many Westerners have come to Buddhism as individuals, having found the teachings to be beneficial in our lives. This may lead us to find other birds with whom we can flock together, but it's still fairly common for convert Buddhists to be outliers in their biological families. Though, of course, that's not the case for everyone, as some who've adopted heritage Buddhism share that through generations. Learning about the sasana with one's family can be a very different and rich experience when one is in a non-Buddhist dominant cultural setting like the US. Sumi Loundon Kim is wrapping up 8 years as the Buddhist chaplain at Duke University and the teacher for Mindful Families of Durham. After receiving a bachelor's from Williams College and a master's in Buddhist Studies and Sanskrit from the Harvard Divinity School, she was the associate director for the Berry Center for Buddhist Studies in Massachusetts. Originally brought up in a Soto Zen community in the 70s, Sumi has been a student of Theravada insight tradition since her teens. She is the author of Blue Jean Buddha, Buddha's Apprentices, and Sitting Together, a family-centered curriculum on mindfulness, meditation, and Buddhist teachings. Sumi will join Yale University as coordinator of Buddhist life in mid-2018. So sit back, relax, and have a nice big red robe oolong tea. Our guest today is Sumi Kim. Sumi, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
It's so good to have you here, and this is one that I've wanted to do for quite some time, a number of years from your first book, and here you've come out with like 4 more since then, so we have some catching up to do. But let's start by having you tell us about your background for some of the listeners who might not be familiar with your work.
Oh, thank you. It's such a pleasure to finally be on your show as well. Thank you for having me. I came to the Dharma essentially when my parents started practicing in a Zen community in rural New Hampshire. And I was born into that, 1975. I'm the oldest of 4. We were all born into that. And it was a community in the Soto tradition with about maybe 20 adults and 20 or so or 25 kids. We all lived in the same enormous mansion. It used to be a boys' school. And the adults got up at 5 a.m. for meditation, and when you turned 7 years old, the kids would get up at 5:30 in the morning to join the adults for the last half hour of Zazen. And so when I turned 7, I started that routine and would meditate for half an hour facing the wall with adults around me. And then we would break into a ceremony chanting the Heart Sutra in Japanese. So I learned that at a very early age, and bowing and other chants. And that was followed by Tai Chi. I suppose you really wouldn't find that in a typical Japanese Zen monastery, but we were already doing a lot of syncretic things. So why not throw in Tai Chi? We also did Christmas and sang the Hallelujah chorus. And one of the truly syncretic practices of this community, and I remember my parents participating in this, was to play Zen basketball every afternoon in the parking lot out back. Zen basketball. Yeah, this teacher who started the community was way ahead of his time, I think, with that idea of integrating meditation and Dharma practice into athletics. So my parents would play Zen basketball, and that's what kept them in good shape, in addition to gardening and working hard and all living together. So, that was a pretty wonderful and unique experience for me as an introduction to the Dharma. And that experience as a child has really informed how I understand childhood and spirituality now. So what I remember from that time are two things. One is that my experience of the Dharma was taken in through my senses. I remember the light from the candles, the smell of the incense, how my body moved in a bow, the stories that were told, music, and the posture of meditation, the feeling of the breath in meditation. Everything was very sense-based. We had this Buddha statue somewhere in the building, and since as a child I was much shorter than where the Buddha statue was placed, when I looked up at the Buddha with his eyes half lowered, it seemed to me as if the Buddha was looking right at me. And so I felt like I had this relationship with the Buddha from a really early age, in the way that children can animate even a rock and make it into a pet rock. The Buddha was, there you go, there's your pet rock.
I have my rock right here from high school. Yep.
That's fantastic. Yeah, so the sensory experience of spirituality for me as a child tells me, and from what I've seen with my own children and how they experience the world and how they experience spirituality, has helped me to think about children's programming and teaching children mindfulness and Dharma in a way that works with their senses. So stories, songs, visual arts, dance, movement, the stuff of traditions like bells and candles and incense, I think are all really helpful for children. And that's how I build my program now. The other thing that I got from that early childhood experience was that, unlike many people, I think many people don't have this opportunity. I had the opportunity to do Dharma in community. And that opportunity to live with others and to be reminded almost every moment that we were together for a shared purpose, which was to practice the Dharma, built a very relational feeling for the Dharma, that the Dharma was expressed and embodied and practiced through relationships. And the community feeling, the feeling of belonging, the feeling of support, the feeling of shared purpose was just so foundational to my own spiritual development. So I think children really benefit from being able to be with other children when they practice mindfulness, when they undertake Buddhist practices. And so when my children became of the age where I thought, okay, now it's about time to introduce them to what I learned as a child, I wanted to do that with a community setting and not just me as a mom, along with telling them to pick up their clothes and do their homework and also be mindful. I didn't want it all to come from this one source from which so many other directives were coming, but for them to learn that in a community of other children. And so that's how I ended up starting what originally was called the Buddhist Families of Durham and is now the Mindful Families of Durham. And any parent that I meet who wants to bring these teachings and these practices into their children's lives, I always recommend that they find at least one other family in their neighborhood or ideally a couple others so that the children can be doing this together. It makes a huge difference in how we absorb and expand these teachings into our lives.
Yeah, I can only imagine this as you're describing your upbringing, which is considerably different than my own. And I suspect than many people even listening to this podcast, that you had this interesting full environment of the Dharma. It wasn't just your parents were Buddhist and were raising you and your siblings that way. It was, no, that this was your world. And that, you got to look forward to this. I'm 7 now and I can get up with the grown-ups and do this thing that's all around you in your growing up in your home life. And how, as you were then describing for your own children, not just being, your mom, pick up your clothes, chant your sutras, do this, that it's perhaps less impactful if it's just one aspect of what one is exposed to growing up, that if your peers, the other kids are doing it, and you're seeing adults modeling this behavior, that it can soak in and really be a part of who they are growing up. Have you noticed some of that happening with Mindful Families of Durham? I mean, what's that been like?
That's a very interesting question because that group, much like other religious or spiritual organizations, just meets once a week, Sunday mornings for an hour and a half, versus my childhood, in which I was in it 24/7. So the impact of community once a week versus all the time, I think just watching my own children, that actually the once a week immersion has been really beneficial. Definitely better than if I was just doing it at home. Maybe my husband and I trying to imprint some of this stuff on them. When they go to the community, yes, seeing other adults, other families, other children undertaking the same thing is a message and reinforcement that I think is pretty helpful to them. Yeah, so I actually think once a week is fully adequate. You do not have to give up everything and move into your nearest Zen center in order to get the benefit of community and practice.
So it sounds like it's fair to say that your Buddhist work, as well as your upbringing, just a natural progression from that, has been family focused. And what do you like about that? What is it that's really kept your heart and mind in that arena of sharing the Buddha Dharma?
Great question. I think it's 99% necessity. By necessity, I mean, I don't think my experience is all that different from many other parents. You are suddenly handed this infant, and there's this incredibly steep learning curve just around diapering. For God's sakes, how do I get a diaper on this thing? Then how do I get the poo off? I mean, really. And there's that, and there's feeding, and just the learning curve of the functions of parenting is very high, no less the interpersonal, the psychological, how do you raise a kid? And parents will grab onto anything that can support them. And so if you have a Dharma background or meditation background, that's going to be a very natural go-to. And it certainly was true for me when I was handed my infant daughter, I realized that as competent as I was in many other areas of my life, I was fully unprepared to do this mothering thing. It was a moment of great, or many moments of humiliation, really. And I found that the teachings and the practices of the path were enormously helpful. And as I saw how I was able to integrate that into my path as a parent, I realized that other parents could benefit from that as well. And so I wanted to bring that in. In addition to necessity, I think I also saw that mindfulness in particular and some of the Buddhist teachings were essential to not just being an adequate parent, but maybe even a better parent than I imagined. And that this twin combination of parenting and Dharma practice were in dialogue with each other, and that parenting was actually also helping me to mature as a Buddhist. For example, there's something about the intimacy of the relationship with this little being that is, it's so true, and it exposes so much of the stuff that we maybe didn't want to look at, or we were trying to bypass spiritually, sometimes through the Dharma, that now as a parent we are really called to work out some of our stuff, to figure out some of the things that we hadn't addressed before having children. And so that's just one example of how becoming a parent can actually change and enrich our path in the Dharma. And then, of course, the Dharma is changing and enriching our work as parents. So what I have loved about this is what it's done for me personally. And so I've wanted to share that with other people. And that's where my writing and teaching comes in.
So I'm curious about this learning, if there's a particular aspect to the Dharma that you can recall as you're changing a diaper or sending a kid to school or dealing with someone who's got an owie or whatever it happens to be. One of these really grounding, real moments. There's no bypass in this. I'm wondering, what were some things from your own raising of your children and being in that position that the Dharma spoke to you at that moment? Is like, oh yeah, this, I got it now. Is there anything you recall that was something that really stands out for you, that touched you and helped you during that, and maybe still does?
Oh gosh, I have a couple of stories. I'll pick two, I guess. One is I found that I had a habit of yelling with my kids. I have two kids. And if things weren't going right or well, I would tend to yell at them. And I really was bothered by this. I mean, I yelled at levels I had no idea it was possible to yell that loud, that harshly. I was really,
You use mom voice. It's a superpower. All moms.
oh, it's just, but I use that, it's okay if a kid is about to cross the street and there's something oncoming, you need that voice to kind of yank them by the collar and pull them back from danger. So that it is a helpful voice, but I would use it for things like, they dropped something. It just wasn't appropriate. And it pained me because through mindfulness practice, I was very finely attuned to the pain that I caused my children when I yelled at them. I could see that on their face, and it felt terrible. Despite seeing that, I would still yell, and I would try to use mindfulness to intervene. I could feel myself about to yell. I would try to take a deep breath, or I'd try to, do a mindful pause, but the yelling would overtake me. And I think I'm describing many parents' experience. So I don't feel so ashamed just admitting it in a national podcast. Besides, it was long ago. So I thought, okay, I'm not solving this through the typical mindfulness techniques and I thought, okay, there's something deeper here, and I really got to understand it. So I decided to observe my yelling as if I were an anthropologist. a third person perspective, which I think is one practice that meditation helps us learn to do very well, how to observe what's happening in a non-judgmental way. So I just watched myself, when did I yell? What were the triggers? Why did I yell? How often? Just observe the whole thing. And right around the time that I was taking this more curious and open approach, I happened to hear Sharon Salzberg give a talk, and she happened to mention that the cause of anger, or one cause of anger, is not fear, as many people think, but it's powerlessness. That a cause of anger is not fear, but powerlessness. And I heard this and I thought, that's very intriguing. And so I began to watch what was happening when I felt like yelling that moment before, and I saw it right there. Oh, it's a feeling of powerlessness. So I'll say, please put your shoes on. We've got to get to the appointment by 10 o'clock. And of course, a 3-year-old being a 3-year-old, they don't understand, and they're not putting on their shoes. Put on your shoes. We really have to go. Still not doing it, hitting each other, goofing off, giggling, throwing Cheez-Its on the floor, whatever. Put on your shoes, right? And then still no. And then, the big yell.
Yeah.
Why? Because the feeling of powerlessness was overcoming me. And so what I learned to see is well before I got to the yelling point is that feeling of powerlessness. Powerlessness was beginning to slip away. And that's the thing I needed to observe. It's not the yelling or the urge to yell, but well prior to that. And then I could take the appropriate measures and I could breathe deeply and I could get down on my knees and speak quietly. Sweetheart, isn't it time to put on your shoes?
And not in the dangerous, quiet mom voice.
Yeah. Actually, I was tempted to throw in a swear word there, but anyway, so I actually solved the yelling problem. And so what we can see from that story is that the solution came through a combination of practice, through mindfulness, through observing in a curious and open way, but also through studying and listening to the Dharma. I wouldn't have noticed how anger arises if I hadn't heard Sharon Salzberg, who's a very well-known meditation teacher and Dharma teacher, if I hadn't heard her give that particular point of instruction. So that's one example. The second example is this happened when my kids were around 3 and 4 years old. They were sitting at the breakfast table, and for some reason, there's a good portion of their scrambled eggs had gotten onto the floor. And the floor had a rug on it. Don't ask me why. Who would install a rug in a dining room? But anyway, there was the rug. And I was under the table trying to get these bits of scrambled egg out of the tufts of rug. And I happened to hear myself almost as if I was recording myself and somebody else was listening, saying to them, "Oh, for heaven's sakes, how did these scrambled eggs get on the floor? I just cleaned it. I've been telling you to put your chin over your plate so many times. Why are you doing it like this?" And just kind of on and on. And as I heard myself, I thought, they're only 3 and 4 years old. You're being awfully harsh for children that young. And then I had this thought, I wonder if I have that same voice towards myself. I wonder if I have an internalized harshness somehow. So the next meditation I decided to listen to how I talk to myself very carefully in a way that I hadn't really listened before. And so I got into my meditation posture, took a few breaths, and then I just decided to listen. how do I talk to myself? And within a few minutes, I heard it. And this voice it went like this. What? 30 years? You've been meditating for 30 years and you still can't follow your breath? Sit up. Your back isn't straight enough. Aches already? What kind of meditator are you? This is so embarrassing. What's the point? Just on and on like that. And I was stunned. I was stunned to hear this. This is the way that I talk to myself. And as soon as I heard it, I had 3 insights. They just kind of came boom, boom, boom. The first is that the way that I talk to my children is an exact mirror of how I talk to myself. The second insight, and also I should say to my husband, the second insight was that voice was an internalized way of speaking to myself that I had learned from my childhood, from the way that certain adults around me had talked to me. And that I had absorbed that parental voice, internalized it, and carried it forward into another generation. And then the third insight, and this was really a huge turning point for me in meditation practice, was, oh, for God's sakes, no wonder I don't enjoy meditating. I'm using it as an opportunity to beat myself up. Who would enjoy sitting there for 20 minutes thinking about how terrible they are, how embarrassing they are? It was like scales falling away from the eyes. It was such an important moment. And after that, I decided to practice with myself as if I were a dog. And so when I would meditate and I start to hear that harshness come up, I would like mentally take my hands between my face and go, who's a good girl? Who's a good meditator? Oh, you're such a good meditator. Just change how I was relating. And then I started to do loving kindness practice for myself, especially, and begin to change the way that I talk to myself. And wouldn't you know it, the way that I talk to my children, the way that I talk to my spouse, automatically changed. I didn't have to be mindful of it. I didn't have to think about what I was saying. The voice changed internally, which then led to a completely different way of relating. The more I related to myself with kindness, the more I related to my children with kindness. Mm-hmm. And of course, sometimes this harshness comes up, but I see it much more quickly and I know what it's about. It's not about the kid. The kid is not the problem here. The harshness is, it's my inner voice. And I can make a choice about whether to use that voice or not. So when I talk to parents about, what is the power of meditation practice, of mindfulness practice in parenting, based on my own experience, the power is not so much in the moment-to-moment thing that we're doing with our kid in parenting behavior, but really about paying attention to what is happening in ourselves and transforming that. And when we do that internal work, it has a profound impact on the parenting. So really, the path of Dharma practice and parenting is not that different than regular Dharma practice in any other kind of application. It should be, and I think it's most powerful when it's about this internal transformation and about how we relate to ourselves and how we understand ourselves.
And the rest grows out of that. It's foundational to how we are in the world. And it was interesting listening to you describe the inner critic, that voice. It sounded certainly very familiar to me. Maybe a few folks listening have heard that voice and those words. And it's sometimes very difficult to even during our formal practice, to really listen and notice with some curiosity and not judging what it is that is seen. Noticing, what's this like? What is this? What's here? And I think about various emotions that sometimes people have when they first start meditating. Like, there's it's not necessarily that emotion that's the starting point, that there may be a little bit further to go, because it may be coming from something a little more of a whisper than the shout that you're hearing. And I really like your dog metaphor. I sometimes will do a guided meditation with just first introducing the idea of attention. And it's kind of like a puppy. And you can welcome it back to you. It will come to you and stay with you, and it's happy to be there. Or you can yell at it and yank it, and in which case it's going to keep trying to get away. And that then grows into, okay, so what is your puppy like? What kind is it? What is it like? And of course, all of these are, what are you like?
Yeah.
What's in your heart right now? And it's sometimes very helpful to picture this as something separate. And that helps us just see in more deeply and be closer. So thank you for bringing that metaphor.
Oh, you're welcome. And thank you. That's such a beautiful articulation and a great teaching point. And it's also reminding me how important it is to teach mindfulness with metta, with loving kindness as a practice. I almost can't imagine teaching mindfulness now without teaching people loving kindness as well, because a lot of people learn how to notice what's happening, but the other essential part of that is how we're relating to what's happening. Because we can notice and we can relate with lots of judgment and, and that pattern just continues. So we have to pay attention to how we're relating. And sometimes it's not so easy just to choose to be non-judgmental, like, oh yeah, okay, I'm seeing my judgment. Now I'm just going to drop that. I mean, that for some of us is so deeply ingrained. It's not really a choice. And so I think the loving kindness practice is a really essential training to help us shift the way that we're relating to what's happening. And especially with parents, for some reason, a lot of parents who are drawn to mindfulness come, as I did and still do, with fair amounts of self-judgment and a lot of anxiety about their performance as parents and about who they are, and some low self-esteem or feelings of inadequacy. And so this loving kindness component, I think, is especially critical for parents. I'm sure it's true for all populations, but I think essential for parents.
So let's shift a little bit. You have a set of 3 books that's out now. It's a little different than your previous books in that this is a curriculum. Tell us about this. What is this curriculum about?
Okay, so this curriculum is based on the work that I did with the Mindful Families of Durham. And it's a curriculum comprised of 36 lesson plans that goes through, it begins with mindfulness and then goes to kindness practice, followed by ethics, character, and service in the world. So you can see that it's an inside-out progression in a curriculum. And the reason it's 3 volumes is because 10 volumes would be too big. No, because the first volume is 36 lesson plans for adults, for parents. Like, how do you do this practice as an adult? And then the second volume are parallel lesson plans, again, 36, for how you would do that with children. So in the adult volume, you have a lesson plan on, say, mindfulness of the body and how to practice mindfulness of the body. And then in the children's volume, you have this exact same topic, but how would you do that with children? And so there's a story and a song and a craft and a game and a meditation that you can do to teach your child or children that you're with how to do mindfulness with their body. But a lot of adults coming to mindfulness need to learn it for themselves first, so that the adult volume was really necessary to creating this curriculum.
Although the kids' volume sounds a lot more fun, I gotta say.
It is. Yes, we have things like blowing bubbles to find your breath or making pinwheel crafts. The third volume is for children, but I suspect adults will use it too. It's an activity book that has like word puzzles and coloring pages and crossword puzzles. And there's a little craft you can do called Pika Buddha. It's like a paper box you can make, and then you put a little tiny paper Buddha on a paper spring. And when you open it, the Buddha pops out. And so it's Pika Buddha. I think that's an adult craft. So the activity book is pretty essential for implementing the children's lesson plans. So this curriculum is really meant to develop the whole family, because I don't think we should develop just the child, and we don't want to develop just the parent. We want to think about the whole family and develop them together and integrate that into the family. Because, I talked about community before, but the single unit family is like a little mini Sangha. And we parents can be our children's first spiritual, maybe not teachers, but we're their first spiritual companions and models. So the adult development is really essential to the formation of the child.
Yeah, and I think you're right. It's the development of either a parent or a child. They're not in a vacuum. They're in relationship with each other and with the world. And looking at just one aspect of that one person, that's not how we are. We're not on desert island. We relate to one another. And so having that more comprehensive view, let alone fun activities, makes it nicely comprehensive.
Yes.
So interestingly, as you've been speaking, having known you for a while and a bit about your background, your first book centered on a younger generation of Buddhists. And for folks who are listening to the podcast, in addition to the series we've been speaking about, I'll include links to the other books as well. But you're also connected with older generations. And you sit in this, for many, a fairly unique place of getting quite the perspective on the older and the younger generations. And I'm wondering what differences you might see between them. What stands out for you? What do you notice?
So I have actually been asked to talk about this before, and a magazine, I think it might have been Shambhala, asked me to write an article delineating the differences between the baby boomer Buddhists and Gen X and millennial Buddhists. So I did a lot of research. I interviewed quite a few people, and we never published the article because it was the most boring article ever. The article basically came to the conclusion that there's far more continuity between the older generation of Buddhists and the younger generation of Buddhists than there is discontinuity. And there's far more continuity between these two generations than, for example, my grandparents' generation with my parents. So the greatest generation is more distinctive from the baby boomers than the baby boomers are from Gen X and millennial. Not that there aren't some pretty significant cultural differences, but it's not as if the baby boomer Buddhists are static. They have been growing and changing all along, as have we younger Buddhists. And so, for example, when the baby boomers started out, they were more focused on nirvana and dukkha. And, as they matured, they thought of, oh, hey, what about ethics? And, oh, yeah, there's this thing called the environment. And now, wait a minute, racism, structural racism. We got to think about gender parity. So they have been thinking about these things as the decades of Dharma have unfolded in the West. And the younger Buddhists are picking up on that as well, and trying to integrate that into teaching and into community. So I see quite a bit of alignment. I wish I could say there's some there's differences around life stage. So, my elders are contending with things like death and really serious sickness, menopause, their retirement plans. So they're thinking about different things as is natural for that life stage. Whereas, in my generation, we're thinking about things like buying our first home or getting married and raising children and that kind of thing. So but that's just a natural life stage. But in terms of Dharma, I don't really see that much difference. If there is difference, we see it maybe more in the lineages, what priorities the different lineages in the West have. And there might be some slight difference in generations there. I think the younger teachers I'm part of the Gen X Buddhist teachers community. And I think the younger teachers are eager, maybe have more energy or interest in integrating the Dharma into the world, into activism. But I don't want to say that they are the only generation to be interested in that, but there's maybe a little more in there. And they're a little more interested as a whole in trying to get more teachers out there and teaching, whereas there might be a slightly more conservative element in the older generation about who can be considered a teacher and how that happens. But it's really hard to make a generality around that.
Is there anything else you want to share with the listeners about the books or just about integrating Dharma into family life?
I hope there's some parents listening, because one thing that I like to tell parents who are already so overwhelmed, they're like, well, how do I fit this mindfulness stuff in? Just trying to get dinner on the table, take a shower, damn it. One of the easiest ways to integrate Dharma into your family life that takes very, very little effort is to pick up some of the terrific children's books that are coming out. There's a number of books that have come out in the last 10 years that talk about things like mindful eating, or how to work with the mind, or how to be your own best friend. And many of us with children 3rd grade and under read stories to our kids before bedtime. So when you read these books with your kids and they're snuggled up against you, then, it's this association of warmth and of care and of sharing. And then you have the story, and your child is learning something indirectly because the voice is coming from the book. But you as a parent can also be learning something from the story. So that's a really simple way to bring this into your family life. And it's often overlooked. Like, parents think they have to do a ton of things to bring mindfulness into their family life, but it's much easier than that. And the second thing I recommend for parents is actually to purchase and download some great mindfulness songs. There's not that many out there, but there are more that are coming out. And then make a little CD or compilation and pop that baby in your minivan player. And while you're driving your kids around, and you'll all be singing these songs. And songs are great because kids will get these teachings through the music, and it becomes like permanently ingrained. I can still remember the Chef Boyardee song from when I was like 5, right? So we know that jingles can be very powerful. I remember Spider-Man and He-Man as well. Insane that I could remember those. So why not give them some teachings and values and do that through music? So books and music. Make it easy for yourself.
Great suggestions. Thank you. So for folks who are listening to the podcast, again, these books will be linked on the episode page. And our guest today, Sumi Kim. Sumi, thank you so much for being here.
You are welcome.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to hear more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. Sound editing, mixing, and mastering provided by the generosity of Anthony Dominello of StructureFromSound.com. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizen Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.